Welcome back to PJ Takes 5. Today is Friday, September 5th, and the time for an NFL season preview is officially here. But we start today talking about last night's win by the Philadelphia Eagles 24-20 over the Dallas Cowboys on their Super Bowl trophy banner night from last season. So starting off with a home game to defend their Super Bowl crown this season, and it did not start according to plan for Philadelphia, who lost Jalen Carter before the first play from scrimmage. We all saw it. He walked up to the Dallas Cowboys huddle and got in the face of Dak Prescott and spit on his chest. Just a really bizarre situation to see a player get ejected before anyone takes a snap. Probably the first time in NFL history, at least recent history, that's taken place, where a player, and a really good player at that, got ejected before he could even play his first down of the season, let alone a game. So not how you draw up for Philadelphia with Carter coming out of Georgia and some concerns and some immaturity off the field already. There was always this worry that you didn't know what you were getting in the person, and we saw the Bears were one of the teams who passed on him despite having a knee at defensive tackle in that draft. Could have drafted him at 9 and picked up Darnell Wright instead. And for the Bears and for a lot of teams, it just came down to a personal matter, it seems, and didn't feel like they had the people in place to really take that risk, and Philadelphia decided to, and they have good leadership on that team, offense and defense, to keep them in control. And obviously Thursday night, that did not go according to plan. So super bizarre situation. We'll see if he ends up getting suspended anymore throughout the year for this incident. I wouldn't think they probably would, but it wouldn't be the most surprising thing to see him get a game or two suspension from the NFL, because I know they're really trying to crack down on the sportsmanship and unsportsmanlike moments, and that certainly fell into that category. So weird start for them. Having him on that D-line really allowed Dallas to set the tone in the trenches offensively and run the ball pretty effectively with Javonte Williams, who had a really good game and looks to be kind of running away with that running back one spot. For the Cowboys, really no team could get a stop throughout the first part of the game until right before the rain delay in the third quarter there, where Philadelphia forced a fumble on the goal line there and was able to recover it, and then we went right into the rain delay situation. It was really a tale of two halves, and when I say two halves, really looking at that rain delay as the halftime. Like I said, first part of that game, nobody could get a stop, and then the second part of the game, nobody scored at all. So we saw the defensive come out differently. Matt Eberflus's defense for the Cowboys, coming out of break, started to send the corner blitzes out of the secondary and get after Jalen Hurts a little more than they could with just 4 guys down. And obviously a big storyline was not having Micah Parsons and what kind of pass rush they could generate without him there, and it ended up being not the best in the world, but pretty solid throughout the game against a really good offensive line, the Eagles. So kudos for those guys to step up with a guy out, and Kenny Clark played a pretty big part of that from the interior, especially once Landon Dickerson went down with an injury in the fourth quarter there. He got a lot of penetration against the backup guard. The injury is fairly concerning for the Eagles, pretty integral part of that O-line, and probably the third piece behind the tackles there in Lane Johnson and Mailata. So we'll see how he recovers here and if he can get back to the team in pretty quick time. And then going to the last drive there from the Cowboys, they're down 4, and they throw a couple deep balls to CD Lamb, who's as sure as receiver as anybody in the NFL, and just couldn't come down with one pass that was really in his hands. And that would have been a tough catch on 4th down, but one that a player of his caliber should be able to make. So disappointing that the Cowboys weren't able to finish it out there. They had a pretty strong showing and were looking to upset the Eagles, but also everybody picked against them, which was practically the entire world, it felt. Looking at the Eagles defense, the thing that stood out without Jalen Carter in there was just the play of some of the rookies. Jihad Campbell, their linebacker, they drafted in the first round, made a couple good plays in pass coverage there, and then their safety, Andrew Makuba, who they got in the second round, had to play when Sidney Brown got banged up, and he made some pretty good tackles, stepping up into the box and bringing runners down. Philadelphia is still a really good team. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody, but I definitely think that the Cowboys showed something and showed that this isn't going to be a rollover season for them, even though the defense has some question marks and the secondary is looking pretty good. But in the front seven, there's for sure some question marks, and the offensive line looked pretty strong. We had some questions about the running back spot, but Javonte Williams played pretty well. So overall, pretty good showing from the Cowboys. Obviously, would want to walk away with that dub after such a hard-fought game with the delay and everything, but all things considered, a pretty strong showing from them in a pretty hostile environment, walking into the Lions' Den when they're hanging a banner. So great way to start the season, and we're going to roll on down here to our season preview. So I'm just going to go division by division, say a quick word about each team, talk about who I have making the playoffs and how far they potentially go. So we'll start with the AFC North. Looking at Baltimore, I have them winning the North with a really good record, 14-3. And some of these records are going to be a little bit off, obviously, just my kind of prediction. like a Baltimore has potentially the best roster in the NFL. They have a little bit of a weakness at edge rusher spot, which is important. You know, the offense has so many talented players, and that defense is so aggressive that I think they're going to be a tough out. I have Cincinnati finishing just behind them, getting a wild card spot with about 13 wins. Their big thing, they just got to start faster than they have in recent years, and they got to play better defense, and they're established well to both, playing guys in the preseason more than they have recently, and then bringing in a new defensive system, which we'll talk about in a little bit. They should be in a better situation to complement Joe Burrow in that offense. Third place there, I got the Steelers finishing about 500. This is potentially Rodgers' last season, so there's going to be some fanfare. I know they played the NFC North, so he'll get one last crack at all those teams, and then at the Packers, the team that he was with forever there. It's like they're doing a little bit of a last dance thing, so that'll be an interesting watch. And then finishing last, I have the Browns. A lot of questions about them, but I think the biggest intrigue for them is when do the rookie quarterbacks get in, and what does that look like? You know, I think the odds of us seeing Dylan Gabriel at some point are pretty much like 90%. He's definitely going to play, but does Shador play anywhere in there? Does he come in? Do they give Gabriel a couple of games and then give Shador a couple of games? Is he just the third stringer and they don't really give him a shot? That'll be interesting to follow. Heading down to the AFC South, I got the Houston Texans winning that division with about a 500 record. They have some serious O-line problems, and I think they can beat up on their division, but once they get out of the South, it might be a little tough to hold their water against the top teams in the NFL. I got second place team, the Colts, finishing with about 5 wins. They seem to be built around that running game with Jonathan Taylor and a solid offensive line and letting Daniel Jones game manage, but how much can you rely on that philosophy if you're losing games consistently? It gets tough to run the ball effectively in that situation. And then I have the Jags finishing third with about 4 wins. I think they have a lot of defensive problems. Their O-line's good, not great, and they're really built around Trevor Lawrence trying to maximize Brian Thomas Jr. and Travis Hunter. So I'm sure statistically we'll see Lawrence play pretty well, but in terms of wins and losses, I don't think they make a big jump this season. And then Titans, I had finishing last in that division with about 4 wins as well. And that's a different situation just because they got the rookie quarterback in Cam Ward, and they're really trying to build that team from the ground up with the trench warfare. So they could have a pretty poor record, but I think at the end of the season, you could come away thinking that they're in the right direction with a good quarterback and building that team the right way. Heading over to the AFC East, I have the Buffalo Bills winning that division with about 14 wins. They're kind of the new Patriots, where they're the best team in that division by far, and they can beat up on lesser teams twice a season. So they're going to benefit from being in that division and then have to play pretty well against the higher up teams that they play, like the Chiefs and the Ravens this Sunday. Second, I have the Jets finishing about 500. I think they have a pretty good roster, especially in the trenches, which is super important. You lose Elijah Vera Tucker for the season, which could be a big problem, but they've invested in the tackle spots. They've invested on that defensive line. You have a player like Justin Fields who's getting just the full go and doesn't really have any behind them peeking over his shoulder. Between him and Garrett Wilson, they should be able to get a little more done than either of those players have done in the past couple of years. So I like them finishing about 500. Third in that division, I have the Patriots finishing about 6 wins. I'm not entirely sold on Drake May. I don't think we saw a lot last season. I know a lot of people are really optimistic about his performance in the latter half of that year, but I just didn't really think that compared to some of the other guys we saw play the entire season or parts of it, that he showed the flashes that you really want out of a top 3 quarterback. He doesn't have a lot around him, so it's going to be hard to give a full, complete grade at the end of the year, but I do think with just Mike Vrabel coming in and replacing Gerard Mayo, that team's going to look a lot better fundamentally and just kind of day-to-day operation. Probably trending in the right direction, but this year's probably not the year they make it to the playoffs or anything. And then last in that division, I have Miami. I just wonder what their identity is come November and beyond, playing cold weather, late season football. They can get out to a hot start, but then what happens when you have to go to Buffalo, go to New England, go to some of these other teams where playoff circumstances are on the line and the speed slows down just because of the conditions. West, I have the Chiefs winning that division with 14 wins. I have to see them not be one of the best teams in the NFL before I can predict their downfall. And then with about the same record but losing the tiebreaker, I have the Chargers finishing 14-3. Another team that lost a really good player in Rashawn Slater on the offensive line, but that unit's still going to be the strength of that team, and they're going to play man football and they're hardball, and the onus is not going to be on Justin Herbert, but Amari and Hampton in that running game, and then having Herbert come in on third down, having play action, just put him in really easy situations to show off his talents and get the ball to playmakers. And then third in that division, I have the Denver Broncos with 11 wins, also making the playoffs as a wild card team. I just want to pump the brakes a little bit on them. I see a lot of people saying that they could overtake the Chiefs in that division. Second-year quarterback who played really well last year in Bo Nix, but there's still some growing pains that they have to go through, and the defense finished number 1 last year, but it's really hard to finish one in any year, but it's hard to finish one back-to-back seasons, so the defense might take a little bit of a step back. And then going down to the fourth place team, I have the Raiders finishing about 500, 8-9. They're in a bridge era with the quarterback situation with Geno and bringing in a new coach in Pete Carroll, just trying to set up a new foundation for that team and what they look like going forward and how they connect day to day. So I think this will be a good year for them to hit that reset button. Heading over to the NFC North, I got Detroit winning that division, 12-5. Might dip a little bit without their coordinators, losing both Aaron Glenn and Ben Johnson this offseason, but I still think they have a really talented roster that's going to win a lot of games for them. Second in that division, making the playoffs, they have the Chicago Bears, which feels a little biased, unfortunately, with about 10 wins. That might be too many, but I think it's just going to look so much cleaner and more like a professional football team than it did last season under Flus and all the dysfunction they had, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Green Bay, I have finishing 10 wins as well, missing the playoffs. I think going all in on Jordan Love is just the wrong guy to go all in on. Obviously, they gave him all that money, but then this trade for and signed Micah Parsons to a similarly massive contract. I haven't seen a lot from Jordan Love that makes me believe that he's a Super Bowl winning quarterback or a player that can really elevate a team over the course of a 17-game season. So I could be proven wrong on that, but I'm just not ready to call him an MVP candidate or a Super Bowl winning quarterback tier guy quite yet. And then finishing last in that division, I have the Minnesota Vikings with 5 wins. People say they have the best non-quarterback roster in the NFL, but I still think there are some problems across that roster. I look specifically at the secondary. I think Harrison Smith's a really good player, but one that's kind of older on that back end, and Byron Murphy's a really good corner, but that cornerback 2 spot has plagued them for a couple of years here, and I think they're a little bit vulnerable on the inside, getting rid of Harrison Phillips. So overall, I think they're probably going to be a little bit of a disappointment this year, and obviously with the quarterback situation, we have no idea what J.J. McCarthy is going to look like, and he might not be the player that Sam Darnold was last year. Not that he has to come in and try to replicate that, but the production might not be quite the same as a guy who's been around in a bunch of different offenses in the NFL. Going down to the NFC South here, I got Tampa Bay winning that division, 12-5. Baker just has so many weapons to work with. Mike Evans, Chris Godwin coming in later off an injury, Emeka Ibuka, even their tight end situation with Kate Otten, and then they have the really good running back room with Bucky Irving and Rashad White. Offensively, they have so many pieces. When they're going to be without Tristan Wirfs to start the season, so that might be a little bit of a problem, but I think overall they're going to come back and win that division again, and they have so many times in recent seasons. Second, I have Atlanta finishing with 10 wins and making it to the wild card. I think they had some really promising games out of Penix last year at the end of the season. He lost a couple of those games in overtime and at the end of the games, but I think you look at him and you like what the offense is doing, and another team that has a lot of weapons between Bijan Robinson and Drake London and Darnell Mooney and even Kyle Pitts trying to get the most out of him. Their big question mark is that D end position fix, and they drafted Jalen Walker and James Pierce Jr. both in the first round. So if one of those guys hits, I think that's a big improvement. If both those guys hit, that could be a really scary defense. Maybe not this year, but going forward. Third in that division and just missing the playoffs, about 500, I have the Carolina Panthers. Young, another guy who has some pretty good weapons around him all of a sudden. He's going to try to make that jump that we've seen again from the latter half of last season, but it just might not be enough. That defense still has a lot of question marks across it, but I think the offense will look significantly better than it did last year or the year before. And then finishing at the bottom of that division, not a surprise, with the New Orleans Saints that have winning just 2 games. Potentially the worst roster in the NFL, taking away that quarterback position. And then obviously at that quarterback spot, they do have so many question marks between Spencer Rattler and Tyler Shuck. Rattler's going to start the season, but when do you have to play the rookie and see what you have there? I think that they don't have many great options at quarterback, and I think around him there's a lot of dysfunction, so I don't have a lot of optimism for them this season. Heading over to the East, I got Philadelphia winning that division with 12 wins. The defense took some hits in free agency, but the offense still has so much firepower, and we saw a little bit of that Thursday night where they won and didn't even really use A.J. Brown, who just had 1 reception, or Devontae Smith, who had some pretty limited production. So I think when they're full go, they're a pretty scary team. Washington, I have finishing second with 10 wins as a wild card team. Too many bounces went their way last year. So I think they could regress a little bit in the win total aspect, and they didn't really get markedly better, in my opinion, over the offseason, but still a good team with a good quarterback and one that's going to win a lot of games in the NFC. And then third, I have the Dallas Cowboys with about 5 wins. I look at that team construction, and their offensive line looked pretty good on Thursday, but it still, to me, screams that it's really about that trio of Dak, Prescott, CeeDee Lamb, and George Pickens. And besides that, there's a lot of question marks both on offense and defense over the course of a full season. So I have them dipping this season and kind of going into that reset. 2 first-round picks each in the next 2 seasons. And then finishing last in that division, I have the Giants also with 5 wins. The big question for them, when do you press that Jackson Dart button and get that rookie in there to get some snaps? I think he's going to be really good eventually, and I think that D-line is pretty stout, but overall, the offensive line has some questions. The running back situation's not what you want it to be. The secondary still has some problems. I think they're going to show a lot of flashes that give you promise, but probably not translating that into a lot of wins this season. And the last division here, heading out to the NFC West, I got the San Francisco 49ers winning the division 13-4. All going back to that defensive coordinator position for them, I think is really going to help out that unit, even after losing Talanoa Hufanga and Dre Greenlaw. Defensively, I think Brock, the pressure's on him now to hold that unit down, and I think he's made the strides to get into that position where he doesn't have to have people around him elevating him. Rather, he can elevate people around him. Even if you don't have CMC, you have Brian Robinson Jr. right there. You have Brandon Ayuk right there. You have Juwan Jennings, who they just gave a little bit of a raise to, and Ricky Pearsall, the rookie from a season ago that should be able to get incorporated into the offense a little more. Second in that division and also making the wild card, I have the Los Angeles Rams. Their big question mark is just Stafford's health. If he's healthy, I think this is a really solid team and a really dangerous one, especially in the playoffs. But if he misses games, how comfortable are you with Jimmy Garoppolo? And then would you even look to go out and try to get a quarterback from another team, maybe Kirk Cousins with the Falcons sitting in there as the backup? So they're good, but just got to worry about that Stafford situation. Finishing third in that division, about 500 and missing the playoffs, I have the Seattle Seahawks. Potentially a great defensive unit. We saw that a little bit last season with some really athletic players in that secondary between Devon Witherspoon and Tariq Rowland, and then Byron Murphy, their defensive tackle, it picked up. They're another team that's on the rise, but I think they're a year away maybe from really shaking up in the playoffs. And then finishing last in that division, I have the Arizona Cardinals with 4 wins. I just look at this team and wonder what their identity is. James Conner's in there, definitely not a super high-end running back, but a pretty productive player. They probably want to get Trey Benson involved at some point. Kyler Murray, is he going to step up and take a leap, or is he just going to be the player that he has been over the past couple of years, which is good, not great? Marvin Harrison Jr. really hasn't broken out. Trey McBride had a great season last year, but didn't get a lot of scoring done. And defensively, I think they have a lot of question marks as well. I don't think this is the season for them to put some stuff together and make a run at all. So then going down to our playoff picture, just to run through a couple of these. Looking ahead to the championship round, skipping forward to that, I actually have the Rams going on to face the Lions in Detroit, and then the Chiefs going to Baltimore for the AFC Championship there. So Rams, Lions, Chiefs, Ravens as our final 4, and then I have the Rams upsetting the Lions on the road and the Ravens winning it at home. So setting up for a Ravens-Rams Super Bowl, and I'm going to take the Ravens for that. I think they're just a super talented team, and Lamar is such a good quarterback, and Derrick Henry is such a great running back that offense is really scary, especially in late game situations. If they can get ahead of teams in the playoffs, especially with a home field advantage, then they'll be a really dangerous squad. So I have them being the Rams. Again, the Rams getting in there under the assumption that Stafford's healthy, especially heading into the playoffs. I really like both those teams, and the Rams, played the Eagles the hardest in the postseason last season. So I think they're going to repeat that and go to the Super Bowl for the second time under Stafford and McVay. Unfortunately for them, that the Ravens just kept them out in the end. So going down here, some real yearly award predictions. We're going to see these handed out at the NFL honors, after the regular season here. But for Offensive Player of the Year, I have Jahmyr Gibbs, running back for the Lions. I think they're going to kind of go back to basics and run the ball a lot as an offense, and he's going to be a big part of that, breaking off explosive plays on the ground, but also in the screen game and catching the ball at the backfield. I think he's just a super explosive player, and they drafted him, 12th overall a couple years back for a reason, and I think he's going to really take the reins of the offense, and they're going to go as he goes. So I have him as the Offensive Player of the Year. For the Defensive Player of the Year, I have Cal Hamilton, safety from the Ravens. When you talk about unicorn players, I think he definitely falls into that category. Just a big, tall safety who can play over the top, play in man-to-man coverage against tight ends, running backs, receivers, play in the box as a run defender, blitz off the edge. He can do whatever the Ravens want him to do, really. And I think he's going to have a season where he has a couple picks, has a bunch of tackles, has a couple sacks, forced fumbles, everything, you name it. So I see him as a Defensive Player of the Year, getting it all done. Offensive Rookie of the Year, I have Travion Henderson, running back for the Patriots, a really reliable player who can run the ball and catch the ball at the backfield and should be a blanket of security for Drake May in that offense. He's still getting him into that group and into the swing of being an NFL quarterback, and I think Henderson will really help that cause and take a lot of pressure off of him. This is Rookie of the Year. I have Abdul Carter, highly talented player coming out of college and was the first pure defensive player drafted in this April's draft, and I think he's going to very quickly turn heads for the Giants. Like I said, they have one of the better defensive lines in the NFL, it seems, and he's going to be a big part of that and just getting pressure off the edge and getting a lot of looks thanks a lot to Dexter Lawrence in the middle of that defense, taking up 2 blocks at once. I think Carter's going to take advantage of a lot of tackles in the NFL, and he's going to have a pretty good year out the gate. Comeback player of the year, I have Aiden Hutchinson. He was playing so well last year until he got hurt with that season-ending injury, and I think he's rehabbed really hard and is a big part of that defense and that team, obviously up in Detroit. And if he can even come close to matching that production he was on pace for last season, I think he's a no-brainer lock for comeback player of the year. Coach of the year, I have Jim Harbaugh with the Chargers. They're going to take on his identity and just run the ball and play really tough physical football, and he's going to get the most out of Herbert, who really hasn't had a coach like that, who is sound and offensive minded but wants to run the ball and is smart with situational football and timeouts and all the stuff that we saw Brandon Staley in the past fail with the Chargers. I think Harbaugh's kind of the antithesis, and they took a big jump last season in his first year, and I think this season will only continue to do so. So we see the first look at the Chargers tonight. If they can pull off the upset against the Chiefs, I think that could really start this campaign of getting him in the Coach of the Year conversation. Assistant Coach of the Year award, I have going to Al Golden, new Bengals DC. It's an interesting situation because obviously they were a big problem last year for the Bengals and kept them out of the playoffs, but there is some talent on that group. You give Trey Hendrickson a raise to have him return. They draft Shamar Stewart in the first round. Logan Wilson's a linebacker that I still really like. Cam Taylor-Britt and Geno Stone aren't the highest billed defensive backs in the NFL, but two really sound players that can contribute. He's the new DC, was with Notre Dame last year in the same role. And I think if the Bengals do end up being a wild card playoff team, that the defense stepping up will be a big part of it, and just the jump that they made from a really bad unit last year to even a middle-of-the-pack unit this year could land him in that Assistant Coach of the Year conversation. And then finally, for the MVP, I have Joe Burrow. Probably should have won it last year. Would have been the first player since I believe O.J. Simpson to win MVP without making the playoffs. So you couldn't really give it to him just because they didn't have that team success, but that was certainly not his fault. And if they can hit the ground running even better out the gate, I think he's got a real case for getting his first MVP and showing everybody why he is one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. And then for the Super Bowl MVP, going back to my Ravens over Rams predictions, I'm going to give it to Lamar Jackson. If they win the Super Bowl and go on a playoff run, he's obviously going to be a big part of that, running the ball, but also being a deadly accurate passer from the pocket. And if they can win that first Super Bowl in over 10 years, that, you know, he's going to be the reason they do it. So I see him taking home his first Super Bowl MVP after already winning 2 regular season MVPs. Going on down here are some fake yearly award winners that I just made up. I'm going to start on a negative note, biggest letdowns. So I have a team and a player award for this. For the team, I'm going to go with the Cardinals. Kind of talked about them already, but I think there's a lot of problems on the offense surrounding Kyler with good talent. They have a couple players, but I think holistically that unit is not very strong. I know Jonathan Gann is a defensive guy, but the defensive unit has a lot of question marks as well. Outside of Budda Baker, really, everything else is a little bit of a wait and see, just to understand how they can compete in the NFL, and obviously in a pretty good division with 2 teams that have forecasted to make the playoffs and 1 team in the Seahawks to just miss it. So I think the Cardinals are going to be a disappointment this year. And then from a player perspective, staying in the NFC West, I have Sam Darnold. We saw him really ball out last season with the Vikings, and trying to replicate that in Seattle with going from Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison and TJ Hawkinson to now having Cooper Kupp, who they signed, and Jackson Smith and Jigba, I think is going to be a big stretch, and he probably benefited a lot from being in that Kevin O'Connell offense and just having an absurd amount of talent. The Seahawks improved their offensive line significantly this offseason, which I think will help, but overall I just don't think that he has the season we saw out of him last season with the Vikings, and maybe the Seahawks are, eager to see what they have waiting in the flanks with Jaden Milroe, who they drafted in April. Going down to another negative superlative here, I have the worst division being the AFC South. I actually have the Texans winning that at a 500 record. So every other team obviously finishes below that, and I think even the Texans winning that division have a lot of problems, especially on the offensive line, which is a problem for a non-mobile quarterback like CJ Stroud. So I think the South is going to be pretty weak, but then going to the best division, I have the AFC West. 3 teams making the playoffs, and then that 4th team, the Raiders, finishing at about 500. So you look at the coaches in that division, Andy Reid, Pete Carroll, Jim Harbaugh, Sean Payton, 4 guys who, depending on how the rest of their career goes, could end up being Hall of Fame coaches. Harbaugh is the only one of those 4 who hasn't won a Super Bowl. So pretty insane just to think about the coaching, and then going to that next level of the quarterback play. Obviously Mahomes, but Geno Smith's a very solid quarterback. Bo Nix is on the rise. Justin Herbert, I think, is the top 10 quarterback. So top to bottom, I think that's a really stacked division. Going on to the best trade or signing of the offseason, so a player that is on a new team and is going to really help out their new squad. Micah Parsons is in this conversation, but I'm actually going to go a different way here with Devontae Adams for the Rams, a player who's a veteran receiver and knows how to get off the line more than potentially anybody in the NFL, and that's going to be appreciated by a veteran quarterback like Stafford, who's going to be on a different page with him pre-snap. I think these two are going to develop a really strong connection, and then Puka Nacua will be left to kind of clean up everything else, with some had run plays, getting the ball in his hands and letting him go. I think that's a very dynamic duo that they've set up at receiver out there, and Adams is going to have a resurgence here playing for another very veteran quarterback, obviously with the experience he has with Aaron Rodgers. I think a lot of that translates to Matthew Stafford's game pretty well. Going down here to the breakout player of the year, I actually have middle linebacker Peyton Wilson for the Steelers. You look at the Steelers team, especially on that defense, there's a lot of older guys, Cam Hayward, TJ Watt, Jalen Ramsey, Darius Slay, and they're really looking for that younger guy to, grab that defense and lead them to a new generation of Steelers football. And I think he's just a really tough interior linebacker, has some shades of a lighter Luke Kuechly out there. I think this could be the year where he puts it together, and if he can stay healthy, could be a pretty important part of that defense as they look to return to that steel curtain level of defense out there. And then breakout unit of the year, I have the Commanders cornerback room. We all know Marshawn Lattimore is a really good player and a very solid veteran, but Mike Sanastrell entering his second season was great as a rookie and seems to be a total leader, not just of that team, but when he was at Michigan as well. Kind of the heart and soul type of guy on a defense there. So we'll look to see him gaining some bigger matchups, especially against guys in that division, such as A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, C.D. Lamb, George Pickens, Malik Neighbors. There's a lot of really good receivers in that division, and he's going to have some opportunities to play against some of the best in the NFL and hold his own. And then, not to mention their rookie, Trey Amos, second-round pick at the end of the second round. Played at Louisiana for 2 years, then had a year at Alabama and a year at Ole Miss before coming out. 3 picks last year at Ole Miss. Super athletic player, a player who could potentially go outside and force Sanastrell into some more slot situations out of the nickel spot. But I think he's going to play pretty well at the gate for them. I think top to bottom, that cornerback room is going to really put the league on notice a little bit and turn it into one of the better secondaries, but specifically cornerback groups in the NFL. And then going down to our last superlative here, I have coach who won't be fired this season, but will enter next year on the hot seat, and I have Miami's Mike McDaniel. There's a lot of weird stuff going on with them. Tua's health is always a question mark. Tyreek's level of bought in with that team is kind of a question mark. They lack a really physical part of that offense and defense. They have some good edge rushers, but the secondary is kind of messed up, especially at the cornerback spot. I think they're going to struggle this year and probably go into 2026 thinking that they're giving him one more shot to show that he's the right guy to lead that team and bring something to that roster outside of just speed and athleticism and some more downhill, hard-nosed footballs. I don't think he'll get fired this year, but could definitely enter next season on the hot seat. So those are all the awards that I have to give out. We're going to finish it up here with the over-under favorite dog. Going to do these for both the NFL and college every week. Last week just did it for college, obviously, because the NFL hadn't started up. They go 0-4, so there's no way to do worse than that, unless I guess I go 0-8. That could be worse, obviously, but just a couple of general things. Going to try to do more interesting games because I don't love the idea of doing games that nobody's going to be paying attention to. That's not the case for all of these. And then college specifically, I'm really focusing on Division I FBS teams. This is a tough week just because a lot of the ranked teams and more well-known teams are playing cupcakeier opponents and gearing up for the conference play. But we're just going to run through a favorite, over, under, favorite, and dog for each of those leagues. So starting in the NFL, my favorite over is Seahawks versus Niners, 43.5. I think these are two teams that are going to end up having good defenses, but really have a lot of firepower offensively. And I know I was talking about Darnold, but as long as he can get the ball to Smith and Jigba and Kupp and let them kind of work with it and let Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet run out of the backfield, they could put up a couple of points. And same with the Niners, where you just got to have Purdy get the ball into the hands of his playmakers, and I think both those teams can end up walking away from that game scoring in the 24-27 range and hitting that over. Under, I have the Saints versus the Cardinals at 43.5 points. Probably the least interesting game on this board, top to bottom, but I think these are two offenses that are going to struggle throughout the year, and neither of these defenses are particularly strong, but I think between Kyler Murray not having the best weapons around him and then the quarterback situation with the Saints being stuck, I think reaching that total is going to be pretty tough for both teams combined. Going down to our favorite here, I have the Los Angeles Rams covering the -3.5 against the Texans. I'm really high on the Rams and not so high on the Texans. I think the Rams have a really strong, young athletic defensive front, and like I said, the Texans don't have a strong offensive line at all. So I think they can get after Caesar Stroud early and often and cause his day to be pretty tough. The Texans do have a pretty athletic defense in their own right, but I think a veteran quarterback like Stafford, even with little practice this offseason, can pick that apart and turn their aggressiveness into a weakness. So I have the Rams covering. And then my favorite dog of the week, Buffalo covering the +1.5 versus the Ravens. I think they'll win this game outright to start off the season in Buffalo on Sunday Night Football, a game that could end up being a early look at the AFC Championship game, but these are two really strong teams, and if this game was in Baltimore, I'd probably pick the Ravens, but just the fact that it's in Buffalo, Josh Allen coming off an MVP season, there's a lot going Buffalo's way, and I think they'll edge it out, and this is basically a pick 'em, to be honest, but I think the Bills will just get it done. So heading on down to the college picks here on Saturday, over I have Mizzou versus Kansas hitting that 51.5. Definitely a high number, but I look at Kansas's offense with Jalen Daniels, and 52 points is something that they could get close to themselves. Mizzou is another team that doesn't play great defense, but can score some points in their own right. So I see this Big 12 matchup going up over 52 points. My favorite under, I have SMU versus Baylor, 63.5 points. I saw Baylor play against Auburn, who probably isn't quite the team that SMU is, and they really struggled offensively throughout the game, and we're playing catch up the entire time. So the only concern is if SMU scores too much, but I don't see this game going over 64 points. My favorite, I have BYU -20.5 versus Stanford. Obviously a pretty big spread, but we saw Stanford in week 0 struggle with Hawaii, who is not the best team in the world, and BYU shows some promise with Bear Bachmeier at quarterback, and I think this is going to be kind of his coming out party a little bit and really dominating a team on the West Coast and Stanford there. And then my favorite dog of the week, biggest game of the week potentially, I have Iowa +3.5 at Iowa State. This is a nasty college football rivalry. In-state, two teams that don't like each other. Iowa is the more sound in the trenches warfare type of game than Iowa State does, and I think ultimately, even though the Cyclones might have a little more talent on offense, I think the Hawkeyes keep it really close and end up winning this game potentially, just to kind of establish the fact that even though they're not the flashiest team, they are the big brothers in that state. Those are my picks. Again, hoping to go better than 0-8. It'd be great to go at least 4-4 and kind of average it out. As we get these picks going, I will look to kind of differentiate my stats between NFL picks versus college picks, overs versus unders, do some data there to show where we're really good at picking and where we're not so good at picking. So that's it for me today. We had to kind of fly through that just because I wanted to talk about every team and all those awards. It should look a little different starting week 2 here as soon as Tuesday with a new episode, talking more about specific games and storylines in the NFL and in college football rather than just running through every single team. So we'll hone in on specific games and specific players and what happened in the games that we watched. But yeah, that's it for today, and I'll see you guys on Tuesday. Peace.